always treat a gun like it's loaded.
Never point your gun at something you don't wish to destroy.
Always know your target and what's beyond it.
Keep your finger off the trigger until you acquire your target.
The Second Amendment was made to fight government tyranny.
Never ever sporterize your mill search. You're killing history.
But what if I have this really cool Tapco stock for the SKS?
Oh, for that!
Welcome to the Millsurf Mike channel. This video goes into the history and detail of the Chinese Type 56 SKS rifle. I will avoid a long history of the SKS in general, as I made a full video on the development of the Russian SKS 45. Click on the card above to watch that video. A quick Cliff Notes version of that story is that famous Soviet firearms designers, including Tokarev, Simonov, and Degtyaryov, were tasked with developing a self-loading rifle prior to World War II. The holdup from a truly successful rifle was the requirement to use the full-power 7.62 by 54mm round currently used by the Mosin Nagant. Simonov would develop what would become the AVS-36 rifle that was even select fire. Due to its complexity and recoil, improvement was sought. Here we get the Tokarev SVT-38 and SVT-40. After the Germans invaded in 1941, the Soviets would crank out more Mosin Nagant rifles and the PPSH submachine guns, as they were much simpler to produce. Two anti-tank rifles, the PTRD-41 developed by Degtyaryov and the PTRS-41 developed by Simonov, that fired a 14.5 by 144mm round, would quickly find use against the Germans. Stalin would soften on the 54R requirement for autoloading rifles after the Soviets captured a prototype of a certain famous German assault rifle, and Elizarov would develop a 7.62 by 41mm cartridge. A boat tail would be added to make the M43 round, more famously known as 7.62 by 39mm. An assault rifle was desired, but Simonov would quickly scale down the PTRS-41 to fire the new round. Early prototypes would see action in 1944 at the Belarusian front and would earn great reviews. The rifle would be adopted as the SKS-45 in 1945. Since the Soviet Union was awash in rifles after the war, production wouldn't begin until 1949, and would only be produced until 1958, as the AK-47 would be adopted in 1949, and variants of the AK are still used by Russia to this day. Only 2.7 million SKS-45 rifles would be produced in the Soviet Union. It would be other Eastern Bloc nations, as well as the Asian communist nations, where the SKS would truly be mass-produced. First, we need to talk a little bit about the complicated relationship between the Soviet Union and China. I attempted to cover some of the warlord era of Chinese history in my warlord-made Chinese era Saka video, link in the card above, but you can get lost taking too deep of a dive in that era of history, as there are more face and heel turns than a poorly written WWE character arc. For what it's worth, I look forward to the Ian McCollum Chinese Warlord Pistol book's arrival. Anyway, by the 1930s, most were consolidated behind either Mao Zedong's Communist or Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang Party, and China would be in a state of civil war. The Japanese invasion would halt the civil war, forcing them to fight together during the Second World War. The end of the Second War saw the Soviet Union occupying Manchuria, which had handed over to Mao's Communists prior to the resumption of the Civil War. By 1949, Mao had control of mainland China, and Chiang Kai-shek would be pushed to Taiwan. Mao and Stalin would sign a friendship treaty in 1950, where China received Port Arthur, the East China Railway, and a $300 million loan to help rebuild. The Soviet Union gained China's recognition in Mongolia. The Korean War would see China get involved with Soviet backing and arms. The relationship between the Soviet Union and China would be much different than the relationship between the Soviet Union and Eastern European satellite states. China was fully independent, and the Soviets couldn't control them. An ideological divide in the roots of communism would start to show, as Mao believed a peasant vanguard would be just as good to bring about revolution as the urban working class vanguard taught by Marx. This would become known as Maoism and be used by several other rural Asian countries over the next couple decades. This divide wasn't a big deal as long as Stalin was alive, as Mao recognized him as the global leader of the communist movement. This changed upon Stalin's death, and Khrushchev's denouncement of Stalin made these cracks between the communist giants grow. While the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe would experiment with reforms, Mao basically entrapped hundreds of thousands with the 100 Flowers campaign, which on the surface was a 1950s Chinese glasnost or Festivus airing of grievances. This would soon be replaced by the anti-rightist campaign, where many of these people who spoke out would experience Stalin-esque persecution and purges. This directly contrasted with the Soviet Union, where people who experienced persecution were being rehabilitated. Khrushchev would seek peaceful coexistence with the West, while China wanted to be more cavalier with nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union would cut off its support for the Chinese nuclear program that they helped start in 1955. China would still detonate their own bomb in 1964. Khrushchev and Mao would fail to make an agreement in 1958 about letting the Soviet Union put naval bases on the Chinese coast. The Soviet Union did not support China's attack on Taiwan because they didn't want to get into a shooting war with the West. The Soviets would give moral support to Tibet during the Tibetan uprising. Mao felt Khrushchev's response to Gary Powers and the Cuban Missile Crisis was weak. The final straw would be the Soviet Union supporting India with arms and technology during the Sino-Indian War of 1962. Mao would break off all diplomatic ties after this. Some Eastern Bloc nations would choose sides during this breakup, most notably Albania, which I'll go to in more depth with my future Albanian SKS video. The split would deepen in weird ways, even after Mao's death and Khrushchev would be long gone. Notably, China and the U.S. being on the same side in support of the Mujahideen during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, while the U.S. and Soviet Union would be on the same side in support of Saddam Hussein against the Chinese-backed Iranians during the Iran-Iraq War. With the larger historical perspective covered, let's get back to the Chinese SKS, since they by far produced the most of these rifles. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, World War II, and subsequent Civil War, both the Communists and Kuomintang would use a hodgepodge of the Hunyang 88 rifles, which is a copy of the Gewehr 88, various imported and domestically made Mausers, including the so-called Shanghai Shek rifle, and leftover Mosins and Arisakas. While the Communists had expelled the Kuomintang from the mainland in 1949, their main concern was to pacify the country and consolidate power. They were on good terms for the time being with the Soviet Union. The U.S. and Great Britain showed no signs of wanting to invade the mainland, and most of their external rivals, namely Japan and Taiwan, were in a severely weakened state. This gave Communist China some breathing room to rearm, at least until the Korean War in 1950. Although the Soviet Union would help arm China, the small arms used would be of World War II vintage. The Soviet Union had just barely started fielding the SKS themselves, with production only beginning in 1949. They would not be handing these rifles out to other nations while they updated their own arsenal. The Soviets would officially replace the SKS with the AK-47 as a frontline rifle in 1953. Since the Soviets already helped China set up the Type 53 Mosin production, a copy of the M44, wind down production of the SKS, and the fact that the cat was out of the bag about the AK-47 since it made its debut against the Hungarian uprising, they would help set up SKS production in Factory 296, later known as Factory 26, in Chongqing, while setting up a Factory 66 in Penang for AK production with their machinery, parts, and technical assistance. The SKS would be referred to as the Type 56 Carbine, while the AK would be known as the Type 56 Rifle. Most of the other factories set up to produce the SKSs and AKs would be set up entirely by the Chinese, as this would occur during or after the Sino-Soviet split. Initial Type 56 carbines would be identical except for the wood used for the stock to the Soviet SKS-45, with a spike bayonet replacing the knife bayonet in the 9mm serial range. In general, especially if you have a carbine from the 26 arsenal, you can date it by looking by the first two digits of the serial number. That would be the year from the beginning it was made. So my 12mm serial number Type 56 would put it in the 12th year of production, meaning 1967. Remember, 1956 would be year zero. Production would take place in dozens of factories dotted all over China, and I'll leave a link below to a Chinese SKS guide, an excellent resource for translating the markings on your rifle. All right, let's take a little closer look at my Type 56 Chinese SKS. I have my Russian out here for a side-by-side comparison. In reality, they're pretty much identical with the exception of the spike bayonet on the Chinese SKS versus the knife bayonet on the Russian. And your first 9 million or so Chinese SKSs will also have knife bayonets on them. They switched the spike somewhere in 1964 to 1965. Now, the very first Chinese SKSs were actually kind of referred to as Sino-Soviet SKSs just because they had a lot of Soviet-made parts, and a lot of 1956 made SKSs would be Soviet parts put together in China until they kind of got their feet on the ground. And then after they helped set up that first factory in Factory 26, I believe is 926. I'll have to correct that if I'm wrong. But after they got that first factory set up and started going, most of the SKSs coming out of other factories would be set up by China themselves, because this was happening during and after the Sino-Soviet split. So anyway, we'll take a little closer look. On mine, you can see the triangle with the 26 right there. That means it came from Factory 26. If you want to know what factory yours is made in, it'll be right there. I believe the lettering, or that's just Type 56, I believe is what that says. And then on your serial number, that'll help you determine the year. If it's within the first 10 years, it'll be the first number, and after 10 years, it'll be the first two numbers, followed by a 6-digit serial number. Mine is 12. Now you got to keep in mind 1956 would be year 0 on this, so that would put this being made in 1967. Now there is no written in law that this is the case. I believe this comes from a document written after a Vietnam capture, Vietnam soldier bring back. So, but that's kind of been the consensus on how you date your Type 56 SKS. And then mine also has a matching number on the stock. Now, for the different factories, I'll leave a link below that from I believe it's Chinese SKS. It's a website that has a lot of good information on there, and it'll keep you from having to buy Poyer's book to find out all the different factories. But I'll leave a link below to what all the different factories are that made these SKSs. And of course, after Norinco formed in 1980 and took over a whole bunch, and then I think I don't know if Polytech ever made SKSs, but Polytech would be the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese Army kind of conglomerate that made weapons. So anyway, let's do a quick field strip here. Basically, on this side, you have this little lever here. You just pull that all the way up and just kind of feel it until you can start pulling it out. Now it's captive, so it won't come out all the way. You can pull your dust cover off. You can pull your spring off. Now make sure you realize which direction your spring went in there. There's kind of a fat portion in the back and a skinny portion in the front. So remember, the skinny portion goes up toward the front. So all you got to do is pull your bolt and bolt carrier back. And this should be enough for you to clean it. I will get into the gas system when I do my Yugo SKS video, because a lot of times there's a gas switch up front that gets corroded and you got to replace that, and I'll probably make a how-to video on that because I had to do that or else my Yugo wasn't semi-auto. But anyway, you got your bolt carrier, your bolt. Now one thing you want to make sure of is that your pin is free floating in there, because if it isn't, if it gets stuck by like cosmoline or dirt, it could cause slam fires, so you might get a surprise when you pull your trigger. Best case scenario is it sounds full auto. Worst case scenarios, it kind of blows up at you. So you want to make sure that that's free floating. Now I did a video a long time ago on a Norinco SKS, and I showed you how to install a Murray's firing pin spring. So anyway, let's put her back together. So we want to put our bolt back in our bolt carrier. Now it's a little awkward doing it this way because, usually I'll be sitting over it when I do this, but trying to get proper angles here. So let's get her back in there. I'm gonna go ahead and push that down. I'm gonna go ahead and put it all the way front just to make it a little easier to put it back together. Remember, the skinny part goes up front in your bolt carrier, and you want to make sure that this is out because that'll help you out a little bit on the, get that in there, and then you just got to kind of, like I said, I'm kind of doing this awkwardly here. You want to make sure your spring is seated in there well, and then make sure that that's pushed all the way up. Pull your lever back in, and you are back together. Like I said, I will get back to the gas system in the Yugo video because it's a little more important for that. So anyway, there's a little closer look at my Type 56 SKS. Let's get back to the history portion of the video. Especially early on, China would seem to prefer the SKS over the AK. A Chinese squad would actually be mostly armed with the Type 56 carbine, while the leader would have the Type 56 rifle. Millions of both the SKS and AKs would be exported, and this would be the main source of small arms to the North Vietnam against the United States. After the war, China would find itself in skirmishes itself with Vietnam. China would look to replace both the SKS and AK with a firearm of their own design, and would replace both with the Type 81 assault rifle in the 1980s. This would be a fully Chinese-designed rifle that incorporated elements of both Type 56s. Norinco would form in 1980 and would oversee many Chinese arms production factories. Polytech would be the conglomerate overseen by the Army. As there would be a demand in the U.S. market for these cheap carbines, Norinco and Polytech would produce Type 56 SKSs and AK clones for the U.S. and Canadian commercial markets in the 1980s and 1990s, until both the Bushes and Bill Clinton would ban Polytech and Norinco. To learn more about this, check out my Mac 90 video, link in the card above. My rifle is a military Type 56 that was produced in 1967. I added this to my collection to bridge the gap needed between the Soviet SKS and Albanian SKS, which is a video that will come in the near future. I obtained this recently with a bandolier and 20 stripper clips for $400, which is actually pretty good for 2022. Shooting is pretty much like shooting any other SKS, although I haven't stretched its legs out past 100 yards to see if there's a difference there. One of the stated reasons the Chinese preferred the SKS over the AK was accuracy. There isn't much recoil, but keep in mind that my fat ass has a tendency to absorb a lot of recoil. While there were definitely better options on the battlefield when this was fielded, you can still do much worse than a Type 56 carbine. Please be aware of where your elected officials and the groups that claim to represent you stand on the Second Amendment. Please join the GOA and get $5 off your membership with the link in my description. If you like this video, check out my other content. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. That really helps out the channel. Thank you for watching, and as always, have a great day.